These ships were actually covered in multicolored shapes and designs. For context, I'm going to play an older clip I made about dazzle ships from this video, link in the description. Then we're going to come back and build off of that video. So if this clip sounds familiar, that's why. Let's check it out. Think back to when you learned about World War I and World War II. Visualize the massive warships that were utilized back then. Now what color were those ships? Were they covered in abstract designs? Or was it solid colors like gray? What do you remember learning? In World War I, and to a lesser extent in World War II, to avoid ship destruction at the hands of German U-boats, ships were painted in dazzle camouflage. This is actually how history goes now, believe it or not. The hulls of dazzle ships were covered in stripes, swirls, colors, and abstract shapes, reminiscent of Pablo Picasso's work. The idea was that the overwhelming mix of colors and shapes would confuse enemy U-boats looking through a periscope, thus making it more difficult to gauge the size, speed, and direction of these dazzle ships. Despite other people's memories, including my own to the contrary, this was a common practice. It started in Britain, but eventually spread to the US. It turns out that dazzle ships were surprisingly effective. So much so that during World War II, dazzle camouflage was utilized again by the US and even used on the decks of ships to confuse enemy aircrafts. Does any of this sound right to you? Growing up on the East Coast and being a big history buff, I've even visited some of these ships. But amazingly, I've never seen one in full dazzle paint, let alone any mention of this throughout history. So all of my education, all of my personal studies, all the documentaries and movies and things that I've watched, nothing. What do you all think? Is this exactly as you learned it? Or is this something completely confusing to you? Recently, I fell down a World War II well of information, and before you know it, I was on the subject of D-Day. The June 6, 1944 Allied forces invasion of Normandy, France to repel back the Nazi forces. Cited as the largest seaborne invasion in history, I'm sure the vast majority of you have heard about this before in history books or articles, documentaries, and movies like Saving Private Ryan. Everyone with an interest in D-Day history has seen this shot before. The soldiers huddled together on an LCVD landing craft, mere minutes before the bullets start flying and the craft door opens. But what's that to the left? Is that the tip of a dazzle ship? Yes. Yes, it is. So get this. Not only are some of the major ships used during D-Day dazzle ships, even a bunch of the Normandy landing crafts and tank carriers are now dazzle ships as well. They are beautifully colored with isometric designs, shapes, and colors. Sure, why not? Everything else seems to change, so why would I think these wouldn't? And here's the interesting thing. If you look it up, you'll find the weird thing is that there are still tons of residue of certain ships and landing crafts that aren't dazzle designs. Some are still gray, but every time I check back on this strange Mandela effect, there seems to be more and more and more. It's almost like it's a Mandela effect in progress, like a slow transition from gray to all of them being dazzle ships. So 5 years from now, if they are all gray, remember they weren't always. In fact, since I made this original video on October 30th, 2019, the amount of digital content available for dazzle ships has exploded. For example, the clip that I showed you from an earlier video, when I made that, I used nearly every single photo and painting I could find on dazzle ships. It was that rare. That kind of information was really hard to find, but now there are so many more photos and articles about this stuff. Let's try to be logical here. Could just be that some of the landing crafts were gray, and some were extremely colorful and vibrant for some reason or another, and everyone just didn't notice and we didn't talk about it. I mean, it's possible, right? You could also say, well, some ships belong to some countries and some belong to others. Absolutely. No one is disputing that. What is being disputed is their existence entirely. But if that wasn't strange enough, that's not even the biggest Mandela effect regarding this day. People online started noticing something was off with photos of D-Day. Take a look at this photo and tell me if you see anything weird. What caused this off feeling for so many people? Perhaps you noticed it yourself. It's the dozens and dozens of balloons floating in the sky. Do you remember seeing these in photographs or documentaries, reading about them, learning about them, ever seeing an article on them? Well, if not, these are called barrage balloons. And on D-Day, the sky was covered in hundreds of them. These anchored balloons created a cluttered mess above the sky to prevent enemy plane attacks, because oftentimes there were bombs attached to these balloons. Historically speaking, this makes perfect sense. It's a great idea, but the rationale isn't the issue. It's that many people online don't ever remember seeing these before. That's where the Mandela effect comes in. When I was doing research for something else entirely, and I first came across these photos, it made me second guess myself for a minute, like maybe this is a photoshopped photo or something else, but apparently it's real, and a lot of people are scratching their heads. So tell me, what do you think about all this? This specific photo right here is my absolute favorite because it's so nonsensical. I love it, and here's why. It doesn't seem real, but here it is. It's the perfect encapsulation of the term historical Mandela effect. So now if anyone ever says, "What's a historical Mandela effect?" you can just show them this photo or this video. Everyone let me know, do you remember learning about dazzle ships and barrage balloons storming the beaches of Normandy? How do you feel about all this?